Good evening and welcome to our program tonight. My name is Isabel Rosenthal and I'm the Programs Associate at the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles. If you're not familiar with us, we are a Jewish museum and cultural center where we welcome all communities and in our work are deeply guided by the Jewish tradition to honor memory, to pursue justice, and to seek learning. It is our hope in our programs to inspire meaningful conversation with the goal to create a foundation for a more just and inclusive society. Tonight, we are thrilled to be in conversation with two internationally acclaimed brilliant authors, Francisco Goldman and Rachel Kushner, as they discuss Francisco's newest novel, Monkey Boy, which is just out this month. Francisco is an award-winning Guatemalan American author, journalist, and college professor who has published 4 previous novels, including The Long Night of White Chickens, which was awarded the American Academy Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction. The Interior Circuit, named by the LA Times as one of the 10 best books of the year. The Art of Political Murder, which is now an HBO movie, and his most recent novel prior to Monkey Boy called Say Her Name, which won the French Literary Prize, the Prix Femina Étranger, which was judged by an exclusive female jury. In 2008, Goldman founded and remains co-director of the Ora Estrada Award, which is given biannually to a woman writer between the ages of 18 and 35, living in Mexico, the US, or Canada, and who writes in Spanish. Francisco's books have been published in 16 different languages, and we are absolutely honored tonight to hear from this passionate and critical voice in American literature. Next, I'd like to introduce Francisco's partner in conversation tonight, Guggenheim Fellow and prize-winning author, Rachel Kushner. Rachel's latest book, The Hard Crowd, just came out in April, and she is also the author of the best-selling novels, The Mars Room, The Flamethrowers, Telex from Cuba, as well as a book of short stories, The Strange Case of Rachel K. Rachel has won the Prix Médicis. She's been a finalist for the Booker Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Folio Prize, the James Tate Black Prize, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, and was twice a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. Like Francisco, Rachel has been published in a multitude of languages worldwide. It is now my honor to hand over the virtual stage to our celebrated guests tonight, Francisco, live from Mexico City, and Rachel, live from here in LA, who will tell us all about the extraordinary coming-of-age autobiographical novel, Monkey Boy. We'll dedicate the last few minutes of our program tonight in answering any questions you may have for Francisco, so please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And without any further ado, take it away, Francisco and Rachel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to talk to Francisco Goldman about his new novel, Monkey Boy, tonight. He can say more, but it was dicey for a minute there because there was a storm in Mexico City and the power went out. So he's actually on a phone at his neighbor's house. I absolutely loved reading this novel. Early on, there's a description of the narrator watching 2 girls whose giggles, Goldman writes, foam over like a boiling pot of squiggly pasta. This description reminds me of the author who wrote it and of the sheer effusive power of this book, which is positively boiling over with perfect and original metaphors and insights. Frank will read a section and then I'll ask questions. But before I do, I want to share 2 quick details with the audience about Francisco, Frank, and how I came to know him. As a person in my 20s who had just moved to New York City, I was invited to meet the writer Mary Gateskill. I was a huge fan and a little nervous as I complimented her on her work in that way we are all embarrassed of when we do it. She and I are friendly now, but way back then, she seemed a little suspicious, understandably, and to deflect my flattery of her, she said, "You should read Francisco Goldman instead of me." So I went home and read The Ordinary Seaman. The other story is that when Frank and I met and became friends in Key West, Florida in January, I think of 2009, we kept getting steered to these semi-fancy literary atmospheres, parties at the homes of benefactors, and so forth. Frank and I rebelled and rented bicycles and saw what we felt was probably the real Key West, which, it turns out, is full of subsidized public housing and struggling people. I'll never forget this renegade feeling of us pedaling around the island and seeing what we were not intended to see. We've been friends ever since, but I continue to read his work not because he's a friend, but because he's a writer of incredible force and originality. Also, he's funny as hell, which is the true mark of a genius. Oh my gosh. So the power just went out, which is why you're.
But now, but my phone is still working.
Um,
I can
so,
read.
do
This
you,
is like camping out. It's like we're on our own.
it's not even glamping. It's just camping.
We're camping. Yeah, glamping, camping. Look, I can read. Look, yay.
Do you
And
want to
the light
read?
will come back on any minute.
All right. Do you want to read that section on page 105 that we talked about?
Sure. And thank you, Skirball Center. Thank you, Isabel. I think this is really hilarious. I've never done a reading like this. Oh, look at this. My wife has just brought me one of these little lamps for reading, which I bought so I could read in bed. But our 3-year-old daughter decided it was just a fantastic toy, and she never lets me get my hands on it. But now here it is. Okay, fantastic. Look at that.
Thanks to Jovi.
Thanks to Jody. It's yes, okay. So this is a scene from Monkey Boy, in which one of the themes one of the narrative lines that runs through Monkey Boy all the way through is he's trying to make sense of his past love life, right? And there was one love in particular that was incredibly important in his life. That's all I'll say. And you'll get a taste of that here. This is in Mexico City. During one of our breakups, one that lasted longer than usual, I did finally manage to tell Gisela on the phone that my birthday was coming up. She'd come out to dinner with me to celebrate my 40th birthday, wouldn't she? My 40th. I knew that would soften her. She was a good person at heart, sentimental in that way. She wouldn't want me to spend my 40th birthday alone. I took her to Maxim's in Polanco. The frou-frou-ness of the place would be campy, romantic fun. She wore the most beautiful vintage lacy white blouse and sat in the back of the taxi like Thumbelina going to the ball with her New Yorkie toad. We drank a couple of bottles of champagne, had a fun night, and I suppose the several months that followed were our happiest, our least rocky. The lie that would deform our relationship was exposed at Mexico City Airport as we stood in the security line, our luggage already checked to Madrid, where the translation of my second novel was about to be published. Now it was Gisela's birthday coming up, and I'd promised to take her from Spain to Fez, Morocco. It was her dream to go there. She was fixated on the notion that she should get to ride on a camel on her birthday, and I'd promised her that too. She lifted my passport out of my hands, opened it, her eyes intensely focusing on what she was reading there for a few seconds. She handed it back and said, "Enjoy your trip to Spain, lying pinche cabrón, but if you come back without my suitcase, te lo voy a hacer de jamón." I'd never heard that phrase before, which I mistranslated as a threat to make me into a ham. I followed her out to the sidewalk near the taxis. We lit cigarettes. She smoked Faros, of course she did, carried them in an antique silver case. I smoked whatever, several in succession, shaking fingers, shoving them into my lips. "What are you talking about? What lie?" She told me, and I was flooded with shame. That lie. When I'd asked her out to dinner by telling her it was my 40th birthday, it was really my 41st. I'd said 40, I confessed, because I thought that if I told her I was turning 41, that wouldn't have seemed a special enough occasion to get her to come out to dinner. Hadn't we made up that night? If I hadn't told her that lie, would we be here now at the airport about to fly to Spain and Morocco? So long as we hurried back to airport security instead of arguing out on the sidewalk, we could still catch our plane. Hijo de la chingada, don't try to blackmail me. Martí called lies the despicable siblings of guilt. But what was I guilty of besides lying? Of stupidity, callow character, of not understanding that a silly lie wasn't just a silly lie. Sure, it wasn't like I tried to pass myself off as 30. It hadn't been that kind of lie. But what did that absolve me of? I swear, I pleaded, I'll never lie to you again. We did manage to make our flight. And then throughout every day and night in Spain, she punished me. Anything that came out of my mouth was to be doubted, was worthless, because I was a liar. Even now, remembering it as I pace around in this hotel room, I feel sadness and regret weighing me down. You could argue that I ended up wasting a decade of my life because of that lie, unable to relinquish what I'd fatally ruined. We had almost 3 weeks before our return flight to Mexico. I told her it was going to be just a few days of publicity in Madrid, but I'd misunderstood, or else nobody had remembered to tell me that the cultural section of the US Embassy had decided to help sponsor my tour, sending me to Barcelona, Zaragoza, Bilbao, Toledo, Sevilla, press, bookstores, universities, even a high school. Gisela fought back with me the whole way, was always going off to sulk, to wander the streets and have meals on her own. The book events she came to, she walked out in the middle of. Later, back in Madrid, I learned from a Mexican writer friend who was living there that the chic Spanish publicist who had accompanied us had begged the publisher to never publish me again. By the end of the tour, and a couple of days resting up and exploring Madrid, we only had a week left for Morocco. I'd promised 2 weeks, another lie. But still, we did get to go. I was carrying all our luggage several yards behind her through the Algeciras ferry port when a Spanish policeman stopped her, gestured back at me, and warned that a Moro was following her. That kind of thing has always happened to me in Spain. That's not a Moro, Gisela answered, the ferry port cop. That's my boyfriend. She was sure that was the funniest sentence she'd spoken in her life. Not a Moro, my boyfriend, ha ha ha. It cheered her up. Thanks to that racist ferry port cop, we crossed the Mediterranean to Africa in a pretty good mood.
Thanks. I love that part. It's quite funny, and in a way, it points the reader toward things about the narrator that the narrator isn't entirely ready to cop to himself, at least not yet. Even as he seems like he is writing this book, meaning this guy, the narrator, he's writing this book, right? Even as you also obviously wrote the book, but he's writing it as we read it. And it seems like he's writing it from the standpoint or interest in something like redemption, where he can go back and revisit these scenes in his life and try to put them together. I wanted to ask you about him. So his name is Frank, aka Frankie, aka Francisco Goldberg, whereas you are obviously all of those three appellations plus Goldman. It's not you, of course, but it's also not you. The sly alteration of your own name. I'm sorry, I'm just going to read my question because it's easier for me. And all the biographical details that follow in the novel remind me of this messianic idea of the world to come, when everything will be as it is now, just a little different. Was this minor insertion of Goldberg for Goldman key to the conception, by which I mean, was it enough to free you into the mythical envelope of fiction, the dirty business of fiction? You mentioned at one point a fictionalizing finger on the scale, which is such a great phrase, but the finger is light here. So do you want to talk about just, I don't know, was that switch of the name part of the magic that allowed you to be kind of both embodying the person, like full of details and remembrances of people and scenes and conflict and hilarity and humiliation and joy, or could you have done this and called yourself, I guess I'm asking. Like, what was the magical quotient that gave you distance to write this novel?
It was a symbolic first step that freed me. It was the first step into a novel, right? I was remember discussing when I was even, why do you choose a certain novel to write, right? And I've written novels about all different things, right? Why this one? Ordinary Seaman, which you mentioned earlier, is about 17 sailors trapped on an abandoned cargo ship in Brooklyn Harbor. Right?
Based on a real situation.
Yeah, but I wasn't there. I blew it up into
Yeah.
total fiction, right? That's just a little thing I read about in the newspaper. It's but that was, I could tell you the ways in which that was autobiographical, but because all novels kind of are, right? But I was looking outward, right? And I think, and I was obsessed with that story. I loved that story, right? About those guys trapped, central urban Robinson Crusoe, basically. Robinson Crusoe told backwards, the brown people shipwrecked in the first world, right? It's so what was I thinking about? You have to write about what you're thinking about. No, you can't force yourself to write about something else. And for a bunch of reasons, which we'll get to, I was thinking about very personal things, intimate things. Why not do a memoir? Why not do Goldman? Because fidelity to the facts is boring, and it just won't help you. It won't get you where you need to go, right? So Goldberg was right away a way to fictionalize myself, right? And to quote, or to maybe misquote Cynthia Ozick, I think it was, is, just because a novel is autobiographical doesn't mean it's an autobiography, right? And so Goldberg was the first step towards taking myself as a subject, but fictionalizing myself, beginning that thing that is a novel, where hopefully it's a way to think in stories. It's a way, obviously, to imagine in stories. It's a way to create something, right? That moves in time through pages with a structure that you go looking for, and that somehow, in the end, means something you hadn't foreseen, brings you someplace where, you're finally, when you finish after so many years, you're at a kind of rest and says, I did what I wanted to do. And where its meanings aren't meanings you anticipated, or you may have been kind of aware of looking for them, right? And finally, if someone says, what is your book about? You would say, well, here's, I'll read it from, you want to know what it's about? I'll read from first page to last page, and I will tell you what it's about.
Right.
Yeah.
Like if you could sum it up in a few sentences, it would render the journey of the novel basically unnecessary.
Unnecessary, right? And I wouldn't be able to anyway, obviously. No, but if I were to do an autobiography, I could. I'd say it's my life story. This is what happened, and I wanted to leave that testament for my grandchildren to read, right?
Do you think that adding in a bit of fictional, just that adjustment of the name alone for me, for some reason, and maybe it's because I know you, seems to already promise a lot of humor, even if you're going to get into material in the book that is quite serious. But there's something fun and light and also kind of self-deprecating about this Goldman-Goldberg switch.
Yes, you're so right. It's like, I can't do anything. Like, the enemy for me of a good novel is solemnity, right?
Yeah.
And taking yourself too seriously. And so, because you're writing about yourself, but you're not taking yourself seriously. Of course, I'm taking myself seriously, but with some levity, with a step away, right? If I can't approach this in a playful manner, I'm not going to find what I'm looking for anyway, right? Which is to surprise myself. Playfulness is how you get to the surprise, along with digging, and following your intuitions where they need to go. Right?
I think that's right. It reminds me of I have a short list, less with authors because I just avoid them, but like with art, there's a few painters like Anselm Kiefer, for instance. To me,
I love Anselm Kiefer.
Well, I was going to say, though, for me, that work is humor free. And so I don't entirely love it because it's just so heavy, And
I was thinking, I used to love those things he did with Rapunzel's hair. That's really all I really know. Those kind of fairy tale things he did, which I just thought were so kind of cool.
I don't know if I know those. I just know those huge gray paintings. But you, Frank, are one of the funniest writers I know. And I had been planning to ask this question later, but in reading the book and thinking about tonight, I had this flash memory of you talking about teaching, which you've done quite a lot of, as being a clown for literature. Did you say that to me once? Something about
Being a literature clown. I may have said it to you. I'm pretty sure that phrase is in Say Her Name too, or somewhere.
it
I
must
think
be.
it is. It's somewhere where I know what I was referring to. It was I think this is also like, again, I teach like one semester a year. I've done it for 20 years now. I'm not an academic,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I didn't even graduate from college. I have enough degree points, and I got into grad school, and I was going to go, but then my life changed, so I didn't go. And I had enough, what are they called? Like taking enough courses, but I kept going to this college. I would drop out, go back. I'd switch colleges, so nothing was all in one place, so that they could. And somehow I ended up teaching college courses, and what I realized was, not knowing what I was doing at all, just trying to share my enthusiasm for whatever we were reading, probably, and whatever. And so I felt like a literature, like I was having to a little bit of imposter syndrome, right, and having to cover up my lack of academic credentials and academic self-confidence, right, by being as entertaining as I could about what we were reading. And then after in Say Her Name, anyone I think was wherever, after Grief, when I had to teach for the first time, and I said, because I'm not a tenured person or anything like that, I was just a part-time teacher. I didn't get any time off. It was off. I had to go to work within months, basically. And I had no humor. I was just completely, and I just couldn't be a literature clown. And the classes were just awful. I think it was just, I couldn't perform. And without being able to perform, right, I couldn't, but I think that gets to, that is related to a lot of things, right? It's if you look at my life, for example, the things I've been around, the things that have shaped me, all of which I wanted to write about in this book, except for the grief, right, which we'll talk about. But because other things that had shaped my life, my childhood, my adolescence, most importantly, the 10 years in Central America, it can all sound very heavy. And a lot of people, they're stereotype even of what they think a writer who has like spent 10 years, in Central America in the war years or that kind of thing, or who grew up in a household full of abuse or all those things. They would expect something very solemn. No, and I get that all the time. I've had so many people tell me, I never expected you to be funny, because they thought, and of course, the lesson we all have, certainly among Latin American writers, but I don't think just Latin American writers, is the only way to write about this stuff. The only way to get enough distance to really see it for what it is, to put it in perspective, to not drown in self-importance, right, and solemnity, is through humor.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Bolaño is kind of the clown prince of that. Where's that? How's that spiel? I just love that he does in Savage Detectives, who says, what begins as comedy ends as tragedy. What begins as tragedy ends as tragic comedy. What begins as comedy ends as horror. What begins as comedy ends as, a dirge from the void. And I love that, like comedy and the dirge from the void, right? They go together. You need comedy to write about the void, really, and my example of that, even in literature, would be, if you've read 2666 by Bolaño.
I was just going to actually cite a scene from it, but tell me which one you were going to mention.
Just talk about a dirge from the void, part about the crimes, right?
Yes.
It's just the heaviest, most brutal, most violent, most heartbreaking, depiction of human cruelty you can imagine, as he knew it was. And yet it has some of his funniest writing. And it ends, that last scene when he's finally pulling out of Santa Teresa. And he describes that dark street, one of those dark streets that, women are being disappeared from. And this just nightmare that's befallen the city of Santa Teresa, which is Ciudad Juarez. And the last line in that last paragraph, he just describes the darkened street, and just from somewhere, the sound of laughter. No, and that comedy and the dirge of the void. No, it's like they have to go together. And I think that's an attitude that is innate to me, it's something certainly when I think of the war in Central America, Guatemala, we had a genocide, obviously. The bravest people I've ever met, the most courageous people I've ever met, have been some of the funniest people I've ever met. No, and I remember this even going back further, a line somewhere from Hemingway, one of his Spanish Civil War stories, and he says, the bravest are always the most cheerful. And I did that when I was very young. And when I found myself living immersed in a war situation for so many years, I kept discovering it was true over and over again.
Do you think you became funnier over that long 10 years when you reported on one of the most violent, wars in Central America?
Reported it and lived amongst it. So a lot of the time I was just there trying to work on my novel, and sometimes reporting. And then later, just growing older, I think life makes you, anytime, that thing like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
What doesn't kill you makes you funnier.
I mean, because this book is very funny. Like, there's a lot of places where I thought you were just having a blast. And actually, I want to ask, for me, it was a style question, but it's also very much a humor question. There's this particular scene that, if it's okay with you, I want to read myself. I love to read my friends' work of parts I love. And it reminded me so much of Celine and the way that he exaggerates in Journey to the End of the Night, which in a certain way has a couple of things in common with this novel, I think, in terms of the way that it positions autobiography under the guise of a novel without forcing the reader to even ask or wonder, are these the experiences of the person who wrote this book? Because it's all so drenched in a reality quotient that it doesn't matter either way. But so you're talking about this Latin American Society of New England that the narrator's mother participated in. And here's a description of one of their meetings. Now the society invited people of opposing viewpoints to speak, and they furiously argued over such issues as the coup and military dictatorships in Chile and Argentina, and there was almost always weeping in the audience or, afterward, glasses of wine contemptuously tossed on shirt fronts or even folding chairs hurled. I giggle every time I read that, and I think, do you feel like, I don't know, is there a relationship there between your use of hyperbole and Celine's use of hyperbole? Because you're just going for it and it's so funny. And I don't need to know that that actually happened in that meeting or not. Then again, maybe it did actually happen.
It's, Celine's hyperbole is definitely in my way back there in early influences, and Garcia Marquez's hyperbole, Bolaño's hyperbole, Gunter Grass's hyperbole. There's some of Philip Roth's hyperbole, like in Sabbath's Theater, but there's more of a sharp knife to Celine's. It's
True.
So this was this place called the Pan American Club of New England, that which was a very important place it's a very important place to the mother in the novel. And to my real mother, it was, right? It was her, where she, as a young secretary in Boston, found a sense of Latin American community, even though it was a very strange place, because it had been founded, what in the book I called the Boston Banana Brahmins, right? But it was this kind of it was Cold War philanthropy, right? And so these guys who were banana Brahmins, many of them, right? People with at least investments and some connection to the United Fruit Company, which basically ran Central America back in the 50s. It was just a beautiful building. It had this gorgeous brownstone.
So were
No,
you aware, I just want to ask, were you aware then that these people were involved in the United Fruit Company?
no. As a
Yeah.
young boy, no. But
Okay.
I became aware because then they started to sort of die off, and another generation took over, right? And like it sort of college professor type people, and that's why I said it began to have like people of opposing viewpoints. And I just remember as I was probably as hearing these stories, and there was an Argentine man who ran it. He was the president, and he was a good friend of Jorge Luis Borges's. And I just remember, stories of him getting in fights with people, and just hilarious stories. I mean, I could tell you a bunch of stories about the place. And I remember something. I remember my mother once mentioning somebody throwing wine on somebody's shirt. She was like, "Oh, somebody threw wine on somebody's shirt," And I think
Hopefully it was
that
red.
and that's what I just sort of made. And I know that one time, the guy who was the Argentine, Hector, called, these are the things you remember from a little boy. It's like some very, he was not a leftist, and some very leftist student confronted him in a very aggressive way, and he said, "You are a stupid." And when I was 12 or something, hearing somebody say, "You are a stupid," that stuck in my mind. And the glass of wine thrown in someone's shirt stuck in my mind. And
Yeah.
that's where that came from. It's
So I want to ask you about the mother character and also women generally. I mean, you've written about women extensively in all of your novels, but this book really does seem like an homage to all of these different women, young, old, in between, remembered, and it made me think about, I mean, the fact that I have the luck and pleasure of being friends with you, and so I can kind of combine what I know about your personality with what I see in this book, and I feel like you're a great connoisseur of strong and eccentric women, which I think is part of why we get along. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
that's just the nicest compliment anyone's ever paid me, right? It's I think that this, it gets to the why this book was born in a way, right? I mean, the two biggest, most emotional events of my life.
Oh no. Francisco's frozen.
Incredibly heavy, grief I had to really struggle with. Miraculously, in 212, 213, falling in love with Jovi and having a baby, right? As we did in 218, finally in 218. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you froze for a minute, but now I can hear you fine.
Okay. And in the middle of writing the book, my mother, who was in a nursing home, passed away, right? And somehow, I was raised by women. My mother, the woman that you meet in this book, who was sent up from Guatemala to help my mom and live with us, were very important characters. They all turn up in this book, and some in very fictionalized versions, others less so. And the question that always, that really dogged me, that I really wrote this book to want to explore, was after Aura died, I had never been in therapy before. Obviously, after she died, it was such a cruel, violent death. I needed a grief therapist and all that kind of thing. And the thing that began to obsess me was the question of, why had it taken me so long in life? So I was 47. to really be able to fall in love, to receive love, and to give love. Because sometimes people would give me love, but I couldn't receive it. Right? Or I couldn't give it back. Or I would give it back and the other person didn't want it. I don't know, but it was, and I felt sort of, there was a kind of even guilt in there. Right? If I had been more normal, if I hadn't had these problems of being an emotionally closed off person, sort of, I probably would have gotten married younger. I would be alive. It was a crazy guilt thing, right? But I needed to and then I realized, now, after once, with Jovi, I was so lucky. Now I know how, I feel like I'm good at love now. I'm a good partner now. And I just wanted to look at my life and understand what had taken so long and what had happened to finally make me ready. And I think the book explores all that, right? And it goes through with, I hope, a lot of tenderness and the thing I most wanted is you go through all the different women character in the book, some of whom are ex-lovers, some of whom are family relatives, right? Some are who are the Guatemalan women who used to come up to be with us. I wanted to get as close to them as I could. That was the driving aesthetic of the book as you moved through time and went from these women who meant so much to me in all of my life, many of whom in certain ways I have, I needed to understand what had gone wrong and things like that. That's mostly what I wanted to get in the writing, to get you, to get myself, and eventually the reader as close to them as I could. Right? So that you would just really feel that you could see them and hear them and know them. Really a simple thing to want to do in prose writing, I guess, but it takes a lot of work sometimes. Yeah.
But it also tells us a lot about the narrator, because it isn't just that he gives us a vivid feeling for these women as real people. It's that the narrator gives us a feeling of almost something like his awe of these women, the way he describes them. He notices their clothes, these little details about them, and also he notices little things about them that they don't even mean to reveal, that aren't part of their prepared presentation. It's really like he's a connoisseur of women. In regard to the mother character, Mamita, as the narrator refers to her, clearly, I think, lovingly and openly based on your mother. So she's in a nursing home and kind of fading in her cognition, but there's a way in which her state of mind allows him to finally ask her these very pointed questions about her life, as though he and she are participating in a great mystery that can maybe finally be solved. And it made me realize, oh, this is a kind of profound irony, that as this woman loses her mental faculties, she and her son can both arrive at something like a moment of finally mental clarity. And it's almost as if cognition itself is doing a lot of work all the time to repress and hide truth and clarity. And so it's this right? She's kind of in this fog, but out of that fog may come things that she never would have otherwise divulged.
That's so perceptive, right? That's, it's, first of all, literally, right? She, as he says, she's a woman full of secrets, right? Who always had her guard up. A lot of that was part of her, genteel Guatemalan upbringing. A lot of that was a protection, a way of keeping, bigoted racist assumptions away from her, even when she was like, in misogynist perceptions at arm's length, as she created this facade behind which she could try to build her life in the United States, because she had a horrible marriage, a husband who abused her, and where were people she had to learn to act, to turn her life into something that would have like meaning. She was just incredibly brave. But the other thing about it was too, yes, she always had her guard up. She was constantly, her pretenses, her masks were part of the way she moved in the United States, right? And it's not until she begins, as you just proceed so incredibly well, to have a kind of onset of dementia, that she stops protecting herself in that way and speaks with an honesty, right? That dementia made possible. And he's aware of it, though it's tricky because sometimes he doesn't know if she's telling the truth or if she's lost in a kind of fantasy, right? And he himself, it's interesting that so he's coming at this, he's been away, he's been an absent son. And now he's finally back for the first time in really decades, regularly. And he can go visit her all he wants. And in a way, that desire to get close to his mother, finally, right, and really speak to her and know her is a good way of talking about where he is in life, to a place where you can open up, right, and share. And another aspect of it was I was playing with, all the I was kind of become very proud about how much I'd learned about criminal investigation, and building a case and using evidence in what was the 9 years I spent very close to prosecutors and investigators working on the Bishop Harari murder case, which led to art of political murder. And I was very consciously kind of playing with that way of interpreting reality, of taking pieces of evidence and trying to build them into a narrative and applying them to the way he's trying to discover the truth about his mother, right? So, and things that and really the way you put things together in a case. So you have this, like she used to do this, she used to read, he remembers that she used to read Carlos Castaneda. Why would she be reading Carlos Castaneda? And then, suddenly that same year, for the first time, she was drinking, and suddenly that year, and he's beginning to put these things together, right? And he finally arrives to an idea of what his mother's secret had been, which she, guard down, very cheerfully confesses to him one day in the nursing home. But then later on, he's not sure if she was fantasizing or telling the truth.
I think that in a way that forensic quality is a totalizing quality of the novel itself, because the mystery doesn't just lie with the mother, but with the narrator too, where at least I have that feeling as a reader that he's piecing together a story about himself that has all these moving parts to it, that have to do with, as you say, women, but
Absolutely.
also his father, who beats him brutally, but is also portrayed with a certain degree of tenderness, a complex person, the way that most people are complicated. And the narrator, is bullied, and there are these primal scenes of bullying, which I kind of want to ask you about. They reminded me that, maybe many of us were bullied, but I was bullied in 4th and 5th grade. And I think about those girls that bullied me all the time, and I can get so quickly upset. Still now, it's like it has never subsided. It's almost gotten worse. And in reading your book, I thought, those girls, I bet they never thought about it again. I think they don't even know that, these people don't know that they scarred us for life. So is your book a kind of act of revenge on the bully, or is it a reconciliation, or maybe a combination of the two? And what about the real bullies on which the bullies in the novel are based?
It's not a revenge because it was more trying to understand, how all of that, right? What had it done to me, how how it became something that I had to overcome. In this book, everybody's overcoming something. And that's probably one of the reasons you have that's compassion for the dad. It's compassion because he's a man in pain. There's also something in him that will never forgive the father, right? Not because he used to beat the narrator, not because he used to beat Francisco Goldberg, so much as because of his cruelty to his mother and to his sister. Because I felt like finally, I overcame it, right? Although there's a lot of damage there that he's dragging along. The school that did it, and when you read the book, you understand it. You understand how that thwarted his development, right? They literally had him believing that he was a horrible freak, kind of, right? And it was when I went back there a couple of years ago. I had a residency in Cambridge at Radcliffe Institute, and that brought me back into Massachusetts. I saw a bunch of my old high school friends. Naturally, no surprise, most of them were Trump supporters. It was that kind of brutal environment, right? And as for the actual bullies themselves, the two worst bullies that are portrayed there, to my surprise, I was always going to turn them into fictional characters in this book, because they were people who really did affect me really dramatically. But weirdly, they both passed away during the writing of this book.
Oh, wow.
So that made revenge, any revenge if that was ever intended, completely irrelevant. But what really surprised me, I was on Fresh Air yesterday and talking about a lot of this and how some kids who knew me in high school wrote to me. And I was so amazed that they were so surprised. And this goes to what you're saying, how they don't even remember it, right? They didn't remember me as having been, that unhappy. They didn't remember, they've been really surprised to hear that me talk about how I remembered having gone to school with them. So it were really some interesting emails I got today, the last 2 days. Yeah.
Oh, I bet. I actually heard you on Fresh Air myself. It was a fantastic segment, as the parlance goes. And I had wanted to ask you a question about, Guatemala comes up, and we've already mentioned that you were a reporter there for 10 years during the Civil War. And the interviewer asked you about the state of Guatemala today, and you said full force narco state. I'm always interested in Guatemala for a host of reasons, but mostly because I was a teenager in the 1980s when, Central America was everyone's focus in terms of American foreign policy. And I cared a lot about what went on in Guatemala and Nicaragua and El Salvador. And I also noticed that all these writers I admired, like Joan Didion, went down there and wrote Salvador, and Deborah Eisenberg went down there and wrote Under the 82nd Airborne. And it really felt to me as a teenager, like, I've repeated this pretty often, that like the moral wars of my generation, my historical period, were going to play themselves out in Central America. And you had to turn toward it and think about it and try to understand these different conflicts to understand anything. And I wonder how you feel about that now, if you think that people maybe who were born later don't quite have the sense of how extreme it was. And I also want to ask you about Guatemala City now, today. I live in Los Angeles, where we have a lot of people who come from Guatemala who settle. The next adjacent neighborhood to me is MacArthur Park, and there's so many Guatemalan people who come with very little. They're some of the poorest people who arrive in LA, but actually do better than a lot of newly arriving immigrants in terms of their ability to learn English and assimilate. But what's it like now for Guatemalans in Guatemala? Maybe like Guatemalans who want to become writers and study English literature at the university there and figure out how to make their way as writers. Like, what's that like?
Well, going back to the beginning, right? That was was it, that was my true university, right? I first went, we went there all our lives, especially when we were children, as my mother left my father when I was not even one, and we went down to Guatemala, and we would have stayed there if I hadn't gotten tuberculosis. And that's what made her come back and rejoin my father when I was 3 or so. We went back every summer until around junior high. We stopped doing that. I stopped doing that. And when I was, as I realized I wanted to be a fiction writer, like giving my particularities, I didn't have any place really, right? I mean, sure, my last name is Goldman, but my life had been really, a Latin, I was much closer to my mother and the Guatemalan family, and I was never going to be, going to really write about Massachusetts. There was this place that I had to sort of make my own, which was a place where Guatemala, where my family was from, and the United States, or the other half of my family was from, we're going to have to sort of meet in fiction. And then in real life, that's what happened. They collided in a war, right? The United States was largely responsible for and heavily involved in that war between, and I just knew I had to be there. I knew that was the place I had to learn to experience. And that was, I was very young. I'd never been exposed to violence like that. I'd never exposed to tragedy and suffering like that, terror like that. All the contradictions, all the lessons in politics, and the sense of, how are you supposed to feel about being an American in a situation like this? The incredible loneliness of going back to the United States. And you knew that the United States was directly responsible for so much injustice and suffering. And there you were in the 80s New York, and everybody wanted to go, party at Nell's, and it was just, you just felt so lonely and so isolated, right? It's one of the reasons I've never really been able to really fully return to the US and be totally at home there, right? It became, so it was, more than a formative experience, right? 10 years of my life there, basically. And when you ask about how it became a narco state, right? And why people should obviously care about experience, I spent 9 years off and on covering this case that turned into the book, The Art of Political Murder, which was the first time in Guatemalan history where they'd managed to do justice, right, for a state crime, extrajudicial, politically motivated assassination, where they killed this great human rights bishop. One of the things that made that murder, that investigation possible, was for the first time, because the US is so crazy, when the US, for the first time, Bishop Hardy murder occurred, which was peacetime murder, in violation of all the to democracy and some possibility of nurturing democratic justice institutions and so forth. This murder completely violated it. And this murder marked a turn, essentially, where the military was going to end, the elites were going to be transition.
Oh no, Francisco, at least I can't hear you. You're frozen.
Well, what should you can't hear me now?
Oh, now I can hear you.
All right. Well, it is sort
Cutting in
to
and
make
out.
it really, yeah. Well, to make a really, I'm sorry, to make it, to sum this up, there was incredible effort that was been supported by the US and the world community and the United Nations to strengthen Guatemalan justice institutions. That was incarnated in a thing called CICIG, the UN-supported Commission Against Corruption and Impunity in Guatemala. Marvelous success, keeping Guatemala from collapsing into a state of total, becoming a complete narco state. Trump and Marco Rubio, among others, spearheaded the dismantling of that institution, right? Because Trump doesn't like prosecutors, obviously, especially anti-corruption prosecutors, and he wanted things from Guatemala, and in exchange, this very corrupt Guatemalan government got him to just destroy Guatemala's incredibly brave and unique justice institutions, basically. And so right now, Guatemala is in an abyss, and it's no exaggeration right now to say that it's a narco state. And Joe Biden says that he wants to try to revive, strengthening of backing of brave prosecutors and brave justice workers, and we'll see if it's not too late. Okay, so anyway, I see they want us to wrap up. I'm sorry, but
no, I mean,
yeah,
that's incredible that he caused that kind of damage, and you make me want to read more about what's happening in Guatemala today. Yeah,
and I just also want to add, there are brilliant young writers and especially brilliant young filmmakers. You all are aware of Bustamante, who did the film La Llorona. There's a bunch. I think it's extraordinary the talent in the younger generations, right? And it's not easy to become a writer in Guatemala, but there's some really remarkable young talents there and older ones,
Well, I'm going to ask you more about that since I have access to you beyond this public event. I want to thank the Skirball for hosting it. Thank Frank for writing this incredible book. I urge you to read Monkey Boy. It's so fantastic. You will be laughing and crying, and there's no one who has the sort of just the force of it. It's written with incredible verve and energy that not a lot of writers have, that kind of verve and energy. Frank is very special. So,
for you.
All right. And I hope your power comes back on.
Yeah, well, I'm so sorry this happened, but I hope we got enough. I hope we managed to communicate enough. And my apologies. Mexican internet during the storm season, rainy season can be iffy. And thank you all so much for coming. And my gratitude to the Skirball Center and Isabel and Rachel. You're just such a you're one of the greatest writers alive. I admire you so much, but I especially treasure you as one of my really beloved friends. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks, Frank. Likewise.
Thank you, both of you, Francisco and Rachel, for this conversation tonight. And thanks for everybody in the audience for spending part of your evening with us. We look forward to soon welcoming you back to the Skirball. We are opening to the public on May 15th in a limited capacity with our Ai Weiwei exhibit Trace. And in the meanwhile, please check out our website at skirball.org, where you'll see the many wonderful programs that we have coming up. Thank you, everybody, and good night.